the 1800s, a long time ago, a chief on Turtle Island said, "This is what I know. Our people have lived here in harmony for thousands of years with all that lives and breathes, and all was in balance, and together they all thrived. And we thought these ways would endure, that they would never die. Yes, we thought these ways would endure, that they would never die. They blew out the flames of our songs, stamped out our ancient ways. They said in our own land we no longer belong. Then chiefs of peace became chiefs of war, fighting for the people till they could fight no more. Fighting for the people till they could fight no more."
All he wanted was to return to his beloved homeland on the Lost River in Northern California, to live independently from the Klamath Reservation in southwest Oregon. But what he got was a war that he did not want, and a hanging that he, perhaps, did not deserve. Captain Jack was the leader of the Modoc people. His native name was Kentpoos, translated as having heartburn. He was 5 feet 8 inches tall with a stocky build. He had 2 wives, a daughter, and a sister. Captain Jack and his people lived on the Lost River and Tule Lake area of southwest Oregon and Northern California. Modoc ancestral territory covered over 5,000 square miles.
The land in the southern Oregon region was abundant with wildlife and water. They gathered all through the summer, broke up in small bands, family bands, moved around that way they wouldn't deplete one area. They hunted, fished, gathered, and then they'd come back together for the winter and share their food storages that they had, and life was pretty harmonious.
But a cloud of dust was stirring from the east, kicked up by hundreds of covered wagons headed along the Oregon and Applegate trails in the early 1800s. To the immigrants, the rich volcanic soils of the Klamath Basin and Lost River country were perfect for raising sheep and beef cattle. Land, to the immigrants, meant ownership. To the Modoc, land could not be owned any more than could air, water, or clouds.
Our Creator, when He created it, created a land base, and then He created everything that went with that land base, and then created us. And once He created us, He gave us directions on how to use that land, how to use those resources. And so what I would tell you is the land didn't belong to us. We belong to the land.
Land disputes and bloody revenge killings on both sides broke out between the Modoc and the incoming immigrants. The settlers' solution to end these conflicts was to convince the U.S. government to place the Modoc people on a reservation. The settlers finally got their way. The Treaty of 1864 was drawn up, placing the Modoc on a reservation near Fort Klamath, just north of the town of Linkville, later renamed Klamath Falls. The Modoc were to share the reservation with their old rivals, the Klamath Indians, and the Yahushkin band of Snake Indians. The treaty provided for the cessation of all land claimed by the 3 tribes. Captain Jack constantly complained to Indian agent Captain O.C. Knapp about the horrible living conditions. Captain Jack complained that there was not enough food or blankets to go around. The Modoc had to eat their beloved horses to survive the frigid winter. Captain Knapp, known for his drunkenness, refused to respond to Captain Jack's complaints. "If you come and bother me with any more complaints, I will put you where no one will ever bother you again. Now get out of here." Captain O.C. Knapp.
"I and my people shall not be slaves for a race of people that is not any better than we are. If the agent does not protect my people, we shall not live here." Captain Jack.
Fed up with the indignities of reservation life, Captain Jack, under the cloak of darkness, led more than 300 Modoc out of the Klamath Reservation to return to their homeland on the Lost River on April 26, 1870. Eventually, some 130 Modoc drifted back to the reservation. Captain Knapp was dismissed from his position. His replacement was Alfred B. Meacham, a God-fearing Methodist from Iowa. For 3 years, the Modoc who had left the reservation continued to live on their ancestral lands. Some Modoc, like Bogus Charlie, who spoke perfect English, worked as ranch hands. But the settlers did not like the Modoc in their vicinity. A petition, spearheaded by prominent rancher Jesse Applegate, was signed by local citizens. The petition complained that the military and Indian departments had not done their jobs.
"This band of outlaws who by your delay to enforce the treaty have led to despise rather than respect the authority of the government." Jesse Applegate.
Jesse Applegate and other ranchers wanted the Modoc back on the reservation, whatever it took. In November 1872, an attempt was made to return the Modocs to the Klamath Reservation. But Captain Jack and his people refused to return to the appalling conditions on the reservation. They desired their freedom and independence. "You are directed to remove the Modoc Indians to Camp Yannicks on the Klamath Reservation, peaceable if you can, but forcibly if you must." F. A. Walker to T. B. O'Neill, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, November 25, 1872. Captain Jack's camp was located on the south side of Lost River, just east of a natural bridge. O'Neill ordered Major Green to move Captain Jack's Modocs back to the Klamath Reservation immediately. Major Green saw a way to end the entire Modoc problems with little effort, the element of a surprise attack. November 29, 1872, a day to be remembered forever in Modoc War history.
The weather was bitter cold. Men, women, and children still slept. Gunfire rung out, piercing the silence. Captain Jack and his people scattered, seeking refuge in the brush and hills. The Modoc village was torched. The soldiers piled matting on a sick woman left behind and burned her to death. Another attack on a village across the river was conducted. This attack was led by Oliver Applegate. Many Modocs were killed, including a woman with a baby in her arms. Alfred B. Meacham, minister from Iowa.
The Modocs realized that war had come. Captain Jack's chosen battlefield was in a major lava flow in Northern California, today known as Lava Beds National Monument. The stronghold, 2 miles long and 300 yards wide, had deep chasms running through the fortress, allowing the Modocs to move easily from one end to the other. They had constructed stone barriers about 4 feet in height, with loopholes to shoot through. The Modocs knew the lay of the land and how to use it. The army appeared certain that the war would be quick and easy.
I feel confident the guns will astonish and terrify the Modocs. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton.
The first battle took place on January 17th, 1873. It pitted approximately 300 regular military men, volunteers, and Klamath Scouts against a small band of 50 to 60 Modocs. The plan was to move in early on the morning of January 17th and take the stronghold. The weather would not be in their favor. The soldiers were so close they could hear women and children crying.
I've often thought about my great-grandmother. Here she was pregnant with a baby due any time, and indeed bullets whizzing over her head, and most of all, I've often wondered how she must have felt with this child in her, not knowing if he would even live. And what would his life be like? Where were they going? It must have been a terrible, terrible feeling.
I have never before encountered such an enemy, civilized or savage, occupying a position of such great natural strength as the Modoc stronghold. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton, February 7th, 1873.
A peace commission, including General Canby, Indian Agent Leroy Dyer, and Reverend Eliezer Thomas, was established shortly after the Stronghold battle. Alfred B. Meacham was appointed chairman of the Peace Commission. It is reported that complete amnesty was offered to the Modocs if they agreed to surrender. Captain Jack made a counter-proposal: forgive the Modocs and leave them in the Northern California lava flow where they were. The peace conference was set for Good Friday, April 11th, 1873. The Modoc warriors had voted to kill all the peace commissioners. Captain Jack argued for a peaceful solution to the conflict. But his warriors believed the army would leave if General Canby and the peace commissioners were killed. Captain Jack had to go along with the plan. According to tribal tradition, decisions were made by majority rule.
We're referred to as lajes, and translated that means domestic advisor. I think that kind of summarizes the Modocs' views of how government should happen, because everything was done by consensus of the people. And if you understand that about the Modoc people ancestrally, you realize during the war, everything was done by consensus of the people. The major battles, everything, they gathered together and they made a group decision as to how they were going to proceed.
The Good Friday Peace Conference began in the late morning. General Canby was dressed in a full dress uniform, his saber scabbard empty. The general refused Captain Jack's request to allow his people to live their traditional lives at the lava flow. At exactly 12 minutes after noon, Captain Jack raised his gun from a distance of 5 feet, pointed it at Canby's head, and fired, killing General Edward Canby. Boston Charlie, Captain Jack's warrior, shot and killed Reverend Thomas. Sconchin John, second in command of the Modoc, shot at Reverend Alfred Meacham, creasing Meacham's forehead. Meacham lived to tell the tale. Reverend Dyer escaped unharmed. General Canby was the only general killed in an Indian war. The honors paid to General Canby were almost equal to those paid to President Abraham Lincoln. Thousands attended his funeral in Portland, Oregon. The shock and horror of the Peace Commission killings had U.S. Army troops ready to make the Modocs pay sorely. April 15th, within days of the peace conference, the second battle for the stronghold took place. Troops numbered approximately 600 men. The three-day battle ended on April 17th. Orders were given to enter Captain Jack's stronghold. Triumphant government troops entered the stronghold expecting the surrender of the Modocs. The stronghold was nearly vacated, with the exception of one elderly woman and a wounded elderly man. In an attempt to locate the elusive Modocs, a patrol of 64 soldiers set forth on April 26th from Gillam's camp. The patrol was under the leadership of Captain Evan Thomas and Lieutenant Thomas Wright. The officers believed that this would be a routine patrol. At noon, in the shadow of a small knoll known today as Hardin Butte, the men stopped to eat, some even removing their shoes to rest weary feet. One man began to trim his toenails. But they were not alone. A short distance away, a small band of Modocs, under the leadership of scar-faced Charlie, watched the shoeless soldiers in amazement. As the Army patrol prepared to eat lunch, the Modocs attacked. As scar-faced Charlie stood high on a bluff and watched the carnage, he yelled, "All you fellas that ain't dead had better go home. We don't want to kill you all in one day." The ambush left two-thirds of the patrol dead on the battlefield. One of the first to fall was Lieutenant Wright. Darkness settled in. A rescue patrol finally arrived. There were no doctors. "We came upon the most heartbreaking sight it has been my fate to behold. The fearful ordeal through which the poor fellows had passed, shot down in the morning, lying all day without food, water, attention, or protection from the cold." Second Lieutenant Fraser A. Boutelle. It would be 32 hours in foul weather before the first of the wounded would reach Gillam's camp. A bitter storm of sleet and rain came down, freezing as it fell. In a short time, an overcoat would stand alone. The night was as black as a wolf's mouth. Lieutenant Boutelle. Time was running out for the Modocs. Some 150 men, women, and children had to be provided for, and water was becoming a severe need. On May 10th, 1873, at the crack of dawn, Captain Jack, dressed in General Canby's uniform, attacked the scouting party of U.S. troops camped at Dry Lake, commanded by Captain Henry A. Hasbrook. Hasbrook and his troops were swiftly caught under a blaze of gunfire.
Men rolled over behind saddles and bundles of blanket, no covering, however small, being ignored. They fastened on belts and pulled on boots under a hail of fire.
After battling for months against an enemy they couldn't see, the troops fought with a vengeance. Captain Jack and his men, having enough, turned and fled. June 8th, 1873. Captain Perry and his men discovered Captain Jack and remnants of his tattered band in a canyon at Willow Creek, slightly north of the lava bed.
Jack and his family were secreted in a little cave near the top of the ravine, and within point-blank range of the ledge on which I stood. I told my scouts to ask Jack if he would surrender, and to come out if he desired and give himself up. He replied that he would surrender, but requested time to put on a clean shirt. Captain David Perry.
A stockade was built at Fort Klamath to house the captives, 44 men, 49 women, and 62 children. The space allotted to each person averaged 4 feet by 8 feet. Captain Jack, Sconchin John, Black Jim, Boston Charlie, and 2 other minor warriors were put on trial for the murder of General Canby and Reverend Thomas. All 6 Modocs were judged together, without a benefit of separate hearings. All 6 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to hang on the morning of October 3, 1873. The verdict was of little surprise to anyone.
If they did get a fair trial, even if things had changed and somebody made the decision, hey, let's bring in some attorneys and let's give them their civil rights that we now have today, it could not have been a fair war or a fair trial, because while he's sitting there waiting, they're building the scaffold. So they already knew what they was going to do.
They rounded up a lot of the Klamath people and the Modoc people and made them stand there and watch it. My great-grandfather was forced to stand and watch his father be hung. The military made a big deal out of it. And I think it was done in that manner to make a statement. This is what's going to happen to you if you mess with the United States government.
In all, some 2,000 people were present, including citizens from Jacksonville and Ashland, a jarring 2-day wagon ride to Fort Klamath. The blacksmith removed each man's shackles from his ankles as he prepared to climb the ladder to the scaffold. The hangman settled a noose around Jack's neck after trimming some hair. A white handkerchief was lifted and dropped by one of the military officers. 4 black-hooded prisoners dropped to their deaths on the gallows. Although the 4 bodies of the executed Modocs were placed in graves near the hanging site at Fort Klamath, these men do not rest in peace.
They were decapitated, and the skulls were sent. They were decapitated by the head medical man of the military, and then their skulls ended up in the Smithsonian Institute for years.
October 10th, 1873. Captain Jack's people, including his 2 wives, his sister, and his daughter, were loaded on cattle cars as prisoners of war in Redding, California, for the long and miserable train ride to Oklahoma, where they would resettle on the Quapaw Agency run by Quakers.
I would say that train ride as prisoners of war out of Redding, California, to Baxter Springs, Kansas, and to Oklahoma Indian Territory must have been an extremely frightening thing. Remember, that followed within days of the hanging of Captain Jack and his 3 leaders. So many of them were still very devastated by what they had seen. They say that Princess Mary and Lizzie, who was one of Jack's wives, wailed and moaned the whole first part of the trip. They were still in great sorrow. And the Modocs ancestrally, when they mourned, they would put pitch on their faces and their hair and sprinkle it with ashes. And so I think one of the journalists called them tar heads, and there were all these tar heads, because this wasn't just a typical exile. These people were in heavy mourning. So that, coupled with obviously crowded conditions, things were not easy, and it was a very, very difficult trip. And understand, it was in the dead of winter, and very cold, very difficult trip.
But life would not get much better for the Modoc refugees. Food and clothing were scarce. Medicine was in short supply. Tuberculosis spread, especially among the children. Captain Jack's daughter Rosie was one of the first to die. With the removal of the Modocs, the fertile Modoc country opened up.
Everything looks prosperous, and ranchers are busy attending their cattle and sheep with plenty of good pasture. The whole country is being gobbled up by settlers, and it will not be long before the Lost River and the lava bed vicinity will become a prosperous and wealthy country. Wairika Journal, November 1873.
Despite the efforts of the U.S. Army and the encroaching settlers to remove the Modoc off their ancestral lands, Captain Jack and his band of people are still here in spirit. Their presence can be felt in the ancient lava flows of Northern California, behind every tree and stone, and in the flight of 1,000 geese.
One of the lessons that probably everybody already knows is that, you know what, Gomokums, what we call Creator, created everyone. Everyone has a purpose in this world, no matter what color your skin. And we all have to learn to get along together.
I don't know if we'll ever learn those lessons. There's the lesson there. And I don't know if it comes from where my perspective comes from, but it's, when are we going to learn to share and respect people for who they are? We need to learn how to share. We haven't learned how to share. And to respect those other people for who they are and what their culture says that they can do.
I think the greatest lesson to be learned is that we have to, at all costs, we have to accord dignity to all peoples, regardless of their religions, of their races, of their lifestyles. It is paramount in this country, if we're going to learn from the things that happened in the past, that we acknowledge the beauty of diversity and we allow people to live their own way, and we find ways to get along without going to war.
Spirits walking, the wind whisper, the old ways are gone, and yet they must be carried on, or life on earth will